Hello. This is session 8 of the Nothing Human podcast live Q&A session, and I've left the fan on in my bathroom. So I'm going to go turn it off. All right. So I can give everybody a second to get here and check in, and I don't have really many questions to answer today. So if you have any that you want to ask me, please do feel free to write them in the chat and I will look at them and try to respond. But for now, I have a couple of things that I've been thinking about and that I can talk about, but I probably won't do that right now because I don't think anybody's here. So, um, if you are here, please let me know in the chat. But for the sake of everybody else who might be watching this later, should I say things? Or should I just wait? I think I'm going to wait. Give you all a second. I don't know how you all are doing with the winter storms as well. It was pretty okay over here. I can tell you a little bit about the storm situation. So, let's see. We got the winter storm warning early enough to where we were able to get my parents had a generator. They have a whole house generator, and then they had another generator that's a tri-fuel generator, and so they let us borrow that. And it actually runs off natural gas, and we had a free line that used to be connected to a grill on our back porch, but we're not using that grill anymore because it had a line that had a leak in it and the whole thing caught on fire. And we haven't replaced the grill yet. So instead, we just had a gas line that was there. You know, it was capped or whatnot, but it was there. So anyway, we went and got this generator, and we hooked it up to the natural gas, and we tried to get it started up, and it would not start up. And it was a brand new generator, like we had, put the new oil in it and checked everything, charged up the battery, so everything was like good to go. It just for whatever reason wouldn't turn over with natural gas. And so I looked into it, and on the internet, it said that these particular generators had a spark plug that was more rated for gasoline and propane when they were brand new. And also that spark plug wasn't very good to begin with, like it was kind of low quality. So we drove the day before everything got iced over and went to a bunch of different AutoZones and O'Reilly's and stuff like that. And we found a spark plug that was like a iridium non-resistor spark plug or whatnot that was more for worked better for natural gas. So we got that, changed out the spark plug, started it up, and it was working. We never had to use it though because our power never went out. Because the precipitation was never apparently large enough or bad enough to cause the power to go out. So, anyway, we had some friends down from South Carolina, and they hung out with us, and I baked a lot and made a bunch of cookies and stuff, and we just hung out, and it was really good. All right. Well, if anybody's there, you can let me know in the chat. If you're listening, I personally I have stuff I could talk about, I guess, but I'm trying to make this more of an interactive thing. So if you have something that you want to ask okay, hi. Yeah, hi. How's it going? Okay. So you're there. And, yeah, you can ask a question if you want, or I have been thinking a lot, and we'll probably do maybe like a bonus episode podcast or something on the movie Knives Out, Wake Up Dead Man. I don't know if you all have seen it, but if you have seen it, you can let me know. I'll try to make it like a non-spoiler. Although I don't even know, what do you guys think about spoilers? I have thought for the longest time that I don't care. Okay, cool. So Lisa saw it a few days ago. That's great. That's helpful. So just back on spoilers. I don't care personally about spoilers. I think that if something can be spoiled, it probably should be. But anyway, I understand that a lot of people watch movies for plot and like read books for plot and such. And so if you like tell them plot points, it kind of ruins it for them. I don't really watch movies or read books for plot. Typically, I mean, I enjoy a good plot, but that's not really what brings me back. Obviously, I mean, it's not really what brings you back to read a book again or to watch a movie again. I mean, if because otherwise, why would you? And I guess from what I've talked to a lot of people don't read books again or watch movies again sometimes, which I'm like, I don't know. Uh, Movies don't really do very much for me if they really truly are exhausted in one viewing. I don't even typically like the first viewing if that's all I get out of it. So anyway, spoilers not a big deal for me, but she's already seen it, so it doesn't even matter. Okay, so I was thinking about Knives Out in terms of like questions of religion, because I think that the movie actually addresses religion pretty well. Would you agree that it addresses religion pretty well? You can write that in the chat if you agree with me. But I've talked to a few people who watched the movie and said, like, certainly, definitely, this guy has to be. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, so Lisa agrees. Said that it had to be written by a Christian. It's not. It's not written by a Christian, but it is written by someone who claimed to be a Christian and was steeped in evangelical Protestant Christianity until he was in his 20s. So, like, Christianity was a huge part of his worldview and his upbringing. And his familiarity with Christianity is very apparent in the movie. In fact, he's done a number. Rian Johnson is the guy who wrote it and directed it, and he's done a number of interviews where he talks about the influences of like his biblical literacy and other things, and the ways in which that influenced or affected the movie, including down to some pretty major details that I won't get into too much. But there's like a bunch of biblical allusions and character names that are connected to the Bible and concepts and themes, and like the whole thing is pretty. I don't know. I mean, I almost would consider it a Christian movie in some ways, um, but Benoit Blanc, the detective in the movie, is like an avowed unbeliever, doesn't believe in God, even says so much as like God is a fiction. And he is, I don't know if you'd call him the protagonist of this movie, but he's kind of the protagonist of the series. And so in that sense, it kind of feels like he's meant to be a stand-in for Rian Johnson. That like Rian Johnson kind of identifies himself with Benoit Blanc, because there's even like Benoit Blanc, there's some line, and again, Rian Johnson wrote the movie, so he's like writing the whole thing, and there's some lines in there where he's talking about how my mother's really religious. This is Benoit Blanc, the apparently atheist detective. He says that my mom is really religious, and like there's been like falling out there, and he doesn't want to attend church or anything like that. Like he has a whole thing like a spiel while he's in this church where he basically, says that the whole thing is just a bit of storytelling. It's basically a fable. It's fictional. The whole thing is fake. The church itself is abusive, and everything that it stands for is destructive in the world, and et cetera, et cetera. And then, like, Father Judd, who is the, I mean, at the very least, he is the protagonist for the church. Like, he's Ryan Johnson's picture of, like, what a priest should be. He's probably a lot of people's picture of what a priest should be. But anyway, he responds in that same dialogue with, like, basically, it is a bit of storytelling, but sometimes there are truths so deep and profound that they can't be conveyed with anything other than storytelling, which I thought was pretty interesting. And the movie doesn't make fun of people for believing. It does critique certain things about the church that, I mean, I'm sure everybody, even within the church, is largely in agreement with, that there are abuses, that there are people who are operating as hypocrites, that, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I mean, it's like your standard stuff, you know what I mean? Like, nobody who's existed in the church for any period of time is going to be like, that's not true. Nobody in the church is like that. Like, there's a lot of people who are. So anyway, there's that. But Father Judd is truly Christ-like, and there's actually it's weird because I couldn't figure out, like, if you believed these things, I couldn't figure out why you wouldn't just be a Christian. That's kind of what was weird and puzzling to me. And something Dan said a couple of weeks ago in his question, where he says that everything ultimately boils down to anthropology. I really was thinking about this a lot because I guess Ryan Johnson is saying Father Judd is not like a good Christian or a good Catholic. He's just a good man. And it does seem like that's kind of the idea that he's getting at, is that, like, Father Judd is a good man, and any person could be like this, that in some ways he's representing the best of humanity. Ryan Johnson might even say that about Jesus, that even if Jesus wasn't a historical figure, he might say, at the very least, we can say that Jesus represents the best, most ideal picture of what human beings are striving for, or something like that. It's certainly the case that the movie frames it in those terms, as far as I could tell. I mean, you can disagree with me if you want, and please do if you disagree. But that got me to thinking, because I mean, I've heard it a lot. I know you all have probably heard similarly, that Christianity is basically it. People view Christianity as a fiction. They view religion as ultimately, like, susceptible to destructive possibilities. So, like, I guess they would say that anything that, but I mean, again, sorry, I'm not losing my train of thought. I'm trying to figure out where this thread is going, but so maybe I am. But the issue that I have with it is I feel like, what is religion in those terms but a set of rules or practices that are organized around the promotion of a cause? And in that sense, religion might be considered like a human thing. Like, I don't think human beings have escaped that collective identity around a common cause. I have a hard time I mean, so, like, yeah, my favorite Judd moment was when he was so close to solving the mystery, but immediately left to help the woman with sick mom. Yeah, exactly. So that is super Christ-like, and it's moving to Benoit Blanc in spite of the fact that he's annoyed by it. Judd is Christ-like, but here's the thing: Ryan Johnson might say anybody who's truly operating in a good human way, including Benoit Blanc, should operate and with compassion and kindness like that, and could. And in fact, Benoit Blanc does later on. He does not renounce his atheism or reject his religious perspective. However, he does say, not because of God, God is a fiction, but because of Judd, because of what Judd has done, I learned and I'm following in his example. So again, that kind of points to that kind of human nature, the idealized humanity or idealized anthropology. But I and so the critique would be religion, and there are a lot of people who talk about this. They'll critique religion, and particularly religion that has to do with a god. So, although most people will not critique necessarily like Hinduism or other kind of forms of like more animist religious perspectives. It's most, I don't know, like it's funny, like because to me, I'm sitting here going, any good cause, quote unquote, that people rally around for collective identity, aren't they going to end up potentially doing horrible things for that cause? So, like, for instance, you can't say ultimately that, the Christian religion is the problem, or that, Islam is the problem, or religious extremism is the problem, or anything like that. Well, unless you are failing to see that pretty much every movement that gives a collective a sense of identity tends to create potential for extraordinary abuses and destructive actions. So, for instance, would you say that Marxism is a religion, or that the communism was a religion? It was definitely used to justify some extraordinarily evil things that have been done. I mean, if you look at what the communist regime did, and this is not the only time this has happened, like there's been a lot of collective movements around a quote unquote good cause. For instance, the French Revolution that became the Reign of Terror, that like was very bloody and destructive. The communist revolutions in every area they've ever happened have been very bloody and destructive, and again have all the ritual and cult like aspects that you would imagine from a collective that's joining around a common cause. Again, if you have a good enough cause, it justifies anything. Justifies anything that you could do. If you have a good enough cause, it's justified. And I would say that, if that's what you mean by religion, that like people believe in a cause and they believe this cause so strongly that they're willing to do harm to other people, it's like, well, you can't escape that. You can reject Christianity and it's like a human urge. It's like that's the humanity part of it. If we're talking about like what humans do, they tend to do that. They tend to find a common cause that's good enough to give them a sense of collective identity, and then they tend to do really horrible things in the name of that cause, for the sake of promoting or establishing that cause, which is so valuable or so good that anybody is allowed to do the things they're going to do. Okay, so that's the problem. Does that happen in religious circumstances? Yes. There's a huge difference, though. If a Christian does that, you call the Christian a hypocrite because they're not operating according to the principles they say that they believe. But if an atheist does that, or a communist regime does that, or Marxists do that, or virtue signaling or whatever exclusionary practices go on, etc. Are they being inconsistent with their principles? Like to do evil, like for instance, when the communists took and gathered millions of people and just straight up murdered them or put them in concentration camps or went into all the surrounding areas around, in the Soviet Union and the tributary states and did all sorts of horrible things to all these innocent people, like horrible, horrible things, just generally speaking, you know, rape, burning towns down, stealing everybody's stuff, killing people, experimenting on them, et cetera, et cetera. And it was all fine because these were all enemies. These were all enemies of communism. And so whatever you did to them, there's nothing you could do that was, you know, too bad. The Nazis has the same perspective with the Jews, you know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't say the Nazis were particularly Christian. They obviously use some Christian symbolism, but they use other religious symbolism. They use pretty much any symbolism that was effective to galvanize their particular constituency. It didn't really have a whole lot of. Anyway, all I'm saying is, can you critique them on their own principles? The answer is no. Because ultimately, if you're an atheist, which communism is fundamentally atheistic, if you are an atheist, what isn't permitted? Like, nothing. So the only way you can even call, like, religious people hypocrites is if their religion actually preaches that you should do right or good to others. If it doesn't preach that, then they're not even hypocrites. They can go around doing horrible things and have all the same aspects, negative aspects of atrocities done in the name of a quote good cause. And you can't critique them on their own principles. They're not being hypocritical. They're just following what they believe to be true. Okay. So that doesn't sound very good. And you're pretty much left with that. And I have a really hard time figuring out why Rian Johnson, or anybody for that matter, doesn't recognize that ultimately there isn't a moral framework that is stable outside of Christianity. There isn't one. There isn't one. I'm sorry. I'm like the ideas where you're like, these are so compelling and so true. And it's not just Rian Johnson who does this, by the way. You know, Lisa knows this. Reading East of Eden, I think she has been reading East of Eden as well. My wife's been reading East of Eden. A few people have been reading East of Eden because my sister Colleen read it and she was like, hey, this is really good. And I like Steinbeck a lot. So I read it. I think Lisa's rereading it. And we've been talking about it a little bit back and forth. And it's just very interesting because I don't know that Steinbeck was a Christian either, but he clearly recognized the power of the scriptural stories, the narratives, the themes, the truths that were there. Rian Johnson clearly sees the power of those stories, those narrative structures, those themes. That they're not alone. So many of like the great artists and great thinkers and philosophers, etc., have recognized the staying power and like dramatic philosophical power of Christian themes, Christian ideas, the Christian stories, biblical stories. They keep going back to them over and over and over and over and over again. And you could say, well, they go back to them in the same way they would go back to a myth. And that the myth also has these powerful kind of connections to like primal or almost ancient, you know, truths that we hold to. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. The thing is that what's true in it, is it true or not, I guess. And if it's true, then I mean, what's the difference? I don't know. What is the difference? Like, I know that Tolkien was convinced by C.S. Lewis saying that Christianity has all the aspects of a myth, the only difference being that it is factual, that it's true, that it's the only true myth, that it actually happened. But if it didn't happen, and this is the question, right? Like, this is the question that a lot of even Christians will ask. If it didn't happen, if it's not historical, if it's not factual, is it still potentially true? And I think that what you're left with, if you say yes, I think it still is true, even if it's not factual, even if it didn't happen in history, and even if it's not like real in those terms, it's still true. Well, I think that you go back and you say, well, okay, well, does that actually hold? Like in Ryan Johnson's case, and in the case of the Benoit Blancs of the world, does that actually hold? Is is it good enough for it to be a mythic principle that is not historical? Is that enough truth? And I personally think no. And one of my personal reasons for believing that is because, for one, like I I have a hard time saying it isn't historical or factual, for one. Like, in what case could you say that it ever was non-historical? Like, for instance, it was really weird to me and to Vanessa, my wife, too, when we were watching the movie. And Benoit Blanc has this road to Damascus moment, which, Lisa just mentioned the road to Damascus moment that Judd had, that led him to say, oh, I need to refocus on my ministry and go and talk to this sick woman, or this woman about her sick mom, rather than continuing to doggedly pursue the solution to this mystery. He got sidetracked. Okay, so Benoit Blanc has a similar quote unquote road to Damascus. That's what they call it, a road to Damascus moment, a Damascus moment, or whatever. And he realizes that he needs to set aside his own pride and his own ego and not do his checkmate moment that he longs for. He gives it to somebody else, which, was a selfless act and a kind one. And they're like, oh, so you believe in God now? He says, oh, no, God is a fiction. But I saw what Judd did, and that example that he set then has made me want to act more like that. Well, the thing about what Judd did is what Judd exemplified was Christ-likeness. But it's also the case that Judd exemplified Christ-likeness in a literal, historical, factual way. Right? I mean, like, that's important. Like, if you're saying that the principle or the example that Judd is holding is able to be true even if Judd weren't actually living that way or didn't actually do that, I would say that is silly and foolish. And in the same way, I would say that the principle, for instance, of the resurrection or of the cross or of a life of sacrifice is truly, actually meaningless if it isn't factual. Like, if you were basically just saying, wouldn't it be nice if there were a Jesus who had saved the world? Who cares? Wouldn't it be nice if Jesus did rise from the dead and maintained through that myth the principle of resurrection that we all long for? Meaningless to me. Do not care. In fact, no one cares. And what's really, really clear, if you look at people who have fully embraced atheism, is that the moral framework is totally, completely destroyed. And it doesn't matter. I mean, you can be like, no, there are plenty of Benoit Blancs out there who are Christ-like without believing in Jesus. There aren't. I'm sorry, there aren't. There are not. There are not. And I'm not just going to say it. I mean, go, look it up. Like, go check it out. After Hurricane Katrina happened, how many atheist organizations were there? Private atheist organizations that went out there and helped. Like, I don't know, none, zero. Like, if you go and you look at who's doing charitable work, who's actually voluntarily doing good work in the world and sacrificing of their own at their own expense, you're not going to find most, like, the vast majority of them are conscientious believers in Jesus and operating because they believe that Jesus did this and they too should do it. It's not the principle. And even if you were like, well, what about the principle of selflessness or cooperation? Or it's like, for what? For what reason? Like, you're telling me you're rational. What rational reason do you have to disbenefit yourself in this life for the sake of others? Like, I mean, even if you were saying, oh, it's the benefit of the human race, can you guarantee, I'm talking rationally, from a logical perspective, if we are in fact animals, um, what benefit is it for me to keep, for instance, like, quote unquote, inefficient or degenerate or defective organisms alive? I'm seriously like, what benefit is that for the human race in totally animal, biological, rational terms? Look, and if you're like, that's really messed up, I'm glad you feel that way. But the reason you feel like that is because you have been affected by Christian morality. What I'm saying is, without Christ, without God, why, why would you hold to that? And here's the thing: is you can be like, well, I'm glad people do, but the thing is, they don't. They really don't. Like, without consequences, if you just put the vast majority, even of people who claim, look, I'm not saying, even of people who claim to be Christian, but I'm saying who don't live like Jesus in a literal, historical, factual way, um, then you end up like, just think about it again. Go back to Katrina. When the police force left Katrina, what immediately started happening? It's like, well, looting and rape and murder and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, why? Well, because people are selfish generally. People are selfish generally, and that's one thing. But from a biological or like atheistic perspective, why not? Why wouldn't they be? Why wouldn't they be exactly like that? Like, what moral frame? And again, you're like, well, I think that Christianity represents some of the ideal aspects of human being. What even is that? What is human being? What is it? Like, how do you define it? Where does it stop? Like, do you need to go in and be, and like, at what point does a primate become morally responsible? I'm serious. Like, at what point? Like, where do you draw the line? Like, what I'm saying is that from an atheist, chance, biological, etc. perspective, there is no like definable reason for anything to be right or wrong. There isn't. So it's like, just what is best? What is best for what? Well, for me, for mine, for the propagation of the species, for the propagation of my particular genetics or whatever. I mean, you can define it in a lot of different ways. But you know what you don't end up with? Christian ethics. You don't. You really do not. You don't. And again, like, if you're looking for historical examples, every atheist regime that has ever existed, just, I'm serious, literally everyone that has ever existed, ever. Like, you don't have to go very far. Like, every communist regime that is, explicitly atheist, what's their moral framework? Like, how do they function? And do they tend to, for instance, be considerate of those who are in need? Do they tend to operate in a gracious manner? I'm just asking you to look at it. And if we're talking about rational, logical, evidenced realities, I don't I don't see it working. And here's the thing, is the principle of it. The only like, okay, do you think that Ryan Johnson and Steinbeck and the rest of these people would really appreciate Christianity if they hadn't to some extent seen the real effects of Christianity in the world? Like, do you think that they would appreciate Christianity if, for instance, they didn't live in a time and in a nation that largely had been f- like shaped by Christian moral ethics? I mean, it is very strange, is it not? I mean, is it not very odd that so much of the world perspective on morality is so heavily shaped by Christianity and has been heavily shaped by Christianity, continues to move in that direction? I was talking to somebody about this, just like the very strange fact that you can get slavery free like products or like conflict free diamonds. Like, we're talking about luxuries. So presumably these are being bought by people with money, or at least enough money to be buying things like chocolate and diamonds, which are not necessary for life, in case you were wondering. Well, chocolate might be. Um, but yeah. Anyway, so people are willing to spend additional money in order to get these like diamonds or this chocolate or whatever that's like not produced by slavery or not produced by like child labor or whatever. Okay, so that's pretty interesting. That's a truth. I mean, that's a fact. And I want you to like rewind your mind if you can, if you've done much historical research on humanity, like even 150, 200 years ago, we had, in the United States, we had slavery, right? So 200 years ago, here in the United States, there was slavery. We produced goods with slave labor. People, people did that. Okay, so if you're thinking about that, like think about like what if you were a guy or a slave owner or whatnot, and you were saying, okay, I would like to stop, like, and we're talking, this is 200 years ago, and so like you want to stop doing slave labor. Like you've got a plantation, you inherited it. You're here in the South, let's say, and but you really want to quit. You want to quit being a slave owner. All right, so just think about this. Like, really do. Like, truly, truly think about this. Um, you couldn't send your slaves away from the plantation because if you did, then they would probably be re enslaved. So you're thinking, probably can't just like free them and send them off. Um, so you maybe have an agreement with the slaves. You would go to the slaves and you'd say, okay, so I want to pay you your fair wages, and I want to free you, and you are free, but I highly recommend that you stay here and work for me. You will be totally free. You'll have a house on the property or whatever. It will be your own house. Your life is your own. You can leave whenever you want. But I don't recommend that you leave right now because I don't think it would be very good for you. You might be picked up by other people and become a slave somewhere else where they're not going to treat you very well. Okay, so let's say you did this and you freed them effectively, and you said you can go anywhere. I mean, honestly, if you want to leave, you can leave. But if you will stay here, I will pay you fair wages so that you can be my employee. And let's say the slaves all say, okay, sounds good. We're all going to stay here and we're going to work for you for a fair wage, you know. And now, as soon as he starts paying them a fair wage and providing for them in a way that isn't like subsistence, well, like he has to do one or two things. He has to either reduce his profits on cotton, or he has to raise his prices on cotton. Let's say he's like, hey, I'm willing to reduce my profit down to nothing, as long as we're as long as the plantation is just making enough to stay functional, like we'll just keep doing it like that. So he's basically like got a 0% profit margin, or maybe just a little tiny bit of a profit margin, just in order to have the additional money necessary to like maintain things and, you know, fix things eventually, or etc. Okay, so let's say he does that. He takes his cotton to market, and let's say he has to raise his prices a little bit because he literally can't lower them so much. The margins were too thin, narrow to begin with. So he's got to raise his prices a little bit. He's going to take cotton down to the market, and he's going to put this cotton on the market. He's going to say, "This is slavery-free cotton." And the people in the market are going to ask, what is different about this cotton other than the fact that it was not produced using slave labor? There is no difference. It is not better than that cotton. It's just more expensive. But even though it's no different from that cotton and is more expensive, you can feel better buying this cotton because it hasn't been produced with slaves. Do you think, end of thought experiment. Now the question, do you think people at that time would have bought that cotton? Answer it in the chat if you want. Do you think that people in the 1825 would have bought slavery-free cotton and paid a premium on slavery-free cotton simply because it was not made with slave labor? Okay, some, maybe some. Here's the thing. Did the people in the North who were all like, did abolitionists, did they say boycott Southern cotton? Did abolitions in the North boycott Southern cotton? The answer is no. And they probably did not buy more expensive, not Southern cotton. In fact, the idea of the origin of the cotton, or whether there was a virtuous attachment to it being made without slavery, was really not even an issue. In fact, I would say it's even not an issue right now. Like, there is a market for slave-free chocolate and conflict-free diamonds, and it is a some but not most situation now. But if you look at that time, it's not even, honestly, I don't even think it's a some issue. I think they weren't even thinking about that. Because think about this. Do you think that the goods that we currently have are made with what amounts to slave labor? That most of the goods that we currently use are currently made with slave labor. Do you think that's the case or not? I mean, depending on how you define slave labor. I mean, you can answer it in the chat if you want. Anybody who wants. But let me ask you this. Like, in the thought experiment, they were forced to think about. I don't know what that means. Yeah, I don't. Okay. And the thought experiment, they were forced to think about. Okay, maybe. Okay, in my experience, if we were made to think, Lisa says, we might choose differently. Possibly. But here's the thing. Let's say we don't investigate the source of all our goods. Even if we did, there are certain things where it's like, do you understand all the other things that would have to change? Like, do you understand ultimately that even the price of cotton is an international reality in the 1800s? If you raise your prices and there's a market, for instance, that's willing to pay higher prices for that, then maybe there's a supply that is produced. In the same way that like organic food or conflict-free diamonds or slavery-free chocolate has it as a market. Um, okay, self-perception as a good person is important to people. That's what I'm talking about, and that is true. That is true. However, do you think that people right now, like for instance, iPhone, do you think like this was made by Chinese children potentially? It's certainly made by people who don't really have much of a choice. I'll tell you that. I mean, like even outside the Apple phone factory, they had like nets to for a time anyway to keep people from committing suicide because the despair at the factories was so high. And part of the reason for that is if you think about um, the Chinese, labor market, they're well, just think about China in general. They have huge amounts of human labor, like billions of people, and they have. I mean, that's one of the reasons why they still have so much manual labor available. Is they need work, they need jobs for all the various different people. But if you go into a factory in China to get a job, maybe you get paid $2 or $3 a day. But if you don't take that job, other people will take it because it's the only thing available. So at that point, it's certain that your necessity is being leveraged. That your necessity for a job and your willingness to do it for cheaper is being leveraged in the same way that like illegal immigrants typically, because in China they basically are illegal. Um, they're not non-Chinese. It's just the thing that the hukou system in China makes it so you're basically illegal if you leave your local regional passport area. So if you went into a city and you don't have a city passport, then you're basically an illegal worker. You can, wink wink, keep your job if as long as you're a good employee and you don't complain too much or whatnot. But there's definitely a degree of expendability. There just is a degree of expendability to the Chinese labor force. That is why goods made in China are cheaper. That is why. That is the reason why. And so if you're telling me like, well, the only way to make that okay, I mean, is it a better situation than to boycott Chinese goods? Like, no, not necessarily. Because then what will those people do? Do you know what I mean? And you could be like, well, maybe if you boycotted Chinese goods, then the people who made them, who are, who own these factories or whatever, would hear you and say, okay, we need to pay our workers more, which would necessarily raise the prices, which would necessarily make them less competitive, which would necessarily affect the global market. There's no way around that. Like, it's just the reality. That is just the reality. So, when you're basically what I'm saying is from a biological, rational, non moral perspective, um, honestly, like, slavery is ultimately what you end up with. It just is. Now, do I like slavery? Do I endorse slavery? No, I do not. It is also extremely difficult to escape the forces if a society is not ultimately and collectively pursuing a idea of what is good. Like again, if you're saying, Lisa, self-perception as a good person is really important to people, which I agree with you, it's still the case that if you're in 1825 and you buy slave produced goods, are you necessarily going to view yourself in that moment as a bad person? No, you're not. Because your collective does not say that that is bad. It doesn't. It doesn't. Not as a collective. Meaning, like, owning slaves might be bad, But buying goods produced by slavery is not necessarily considered a bad. If you're even considering where the origin of these goods came from, you're just looking at this suit, and this suit is cheaper, and that suit is more expensive. Which one am I going to buy? Well, what would be the most, reasonable way to use my money that's so limited? And it's like, that's the case with everything. As long as people aren't like, shame on you for buying, in like commercially made dairy. And you have people who go out there and they try to make these social justice kind of things, and like, of all sorts of stripes. I remember a guy who came to our school to tell us about the evils of eating meat. And he tried to make meat and non-veganism disgusting. He said he said that honey was bee vomit, and that eggs were chicken periods, which both of those things are gross, but it's very like appeal to the association of those things to their human counterparts, which chickens are not human, bees are not human. So and I even remember saying, like, if my vomit were as tasty as bee vomit, people would probably eat it. um anyway, he didn't like that very much. But the idea being, like, there's all various different kinds of ways of trying to get certain kinds of moral principles, or like collective principles, in overarchingly accepted. And Christianity has been very, very, very effective over time at um, not even enforcing, but really just inviting people to agree with or accept our moral frameworks, and a lot of the moral frameworks that are derived from narrative historical realities, and they make sense to people. They do. Like, they just do. They work. They make societies better. It's very undeniable. It's very undeniable, in spite of the fact that it really doesn't make biological, rational sense. It doesn't. That's very hard for a lot of people, I think, to accept. But to me, that means that this has to be something that's based in reality. Not only that, that the idea of, like, a profound truth that is somehow or another able to be separated from fact, from the facts that support it or create it in the first place. I don't know. None of that makes any sense to me. I don't think it makes any sense to them either. But they still try to, like, express these ideas, and I think really ultimately hold two things together that don't work together. One, that Christianity ultimately is true, and two, I'm going to like, adopt its principles while rejecting it somehow. It's like, because those principles somehow or another come from something beyond, or not even beyond, almost something below, something underneath the human experience, that supports the human experience, and that is connected to, I don't know, the, like, ideal human or something. But again, I'm like, where does that come from? From a rational, atheistic, or whatever perspective? It doesn't. It does not. It doesn't. It doesn't come from anything like that. Um, and ultimately, if you're looking around and you're saying, why is it that people are willing to buy slavery-free chocolate and conflict-free diamonds? They're actually concerned with people who are weaker, needier than they are, people who need grace, people who, in many ways, I mean, again, like, people who are disabled either because of genetic disorders, or for injuries that they have undergone. From a biological look, from a strictly rational biological perspective, none of those people should be being supported. And atheists forever as much as ugly as that may seem to them, if you look at communist regimes or you look at anti-Christian atheist regimes, they that is what they have done. They have killed useless people, and you can still see that even in. I mean, like for instance, there was a campaign a really long time ago in Iceland to remove Down syndrome from Iceland through abortion. They had pre-screening. You were allowed to get screening, and if your kid had Down syndrome or whatever, then they had a nearly 100% abortion rate of those pre-screened children, and so they're getting rid of Down syndrome in Iceland. So like the rate of Down syndrome in Iceland is apparently really low because of those policies, because of those things. I mean, you I look at that and I'm horrified by the cruelty of that and the mercilessness of that. But from a biological, atheist, rational, whatever, Benoit Blanc kind of perspective, why wouldn't you do that? Like, what is wrong with that? What's even unmerciful about that? You can even make, you could say, well, this person would have had a subpar, not as good life, and they would have, drained the resources of that community and, et cetera, et cetera. Like you can make that argument. In fact, from again, biological atheist perspective, that is the logical, rational conclusion. It's super ugly. I don't like it, but that is the logical, rational conclusion. If you came to a different conclusion than that and said, no, that's not right, my question is, how would you come to that conclusion? What would draw you to believe that's the case? It's like, well, maybe there's a collective that told you that was bad. In which case, I would say, well, how in that sense have you escaped from religion? And I mean, because if it's, oh, well, in order for you to have identity within this collective and identify with this collective, our cause recommends that not be done and that this be done instead. Okay. Well, what if the collective comes back tomorrow and tells me that, slavery is okay, or you should be aborting your Down syndrome kids or whatever? I mean, that's the reason why they're doing it in the first place. Because, like Lisa said, most people do not want to be seen as bad people. So if you're like, I want to see myself as a good person, where's the standard for that goodness coming from? Your collective identity in your community. And so unless the collective identity in the community is actually like Christian, and I mean truly, like unless it's actually Christian and actually is operating according to Christian moral principles, it will ultimately become destructive, tyrannical, selfish, abusive. It will ultimately, reinforce the benefit and the of the status quo and of those people who already have power, and it will typically abuse those who are in positions of weakness. And that's the case within churches that have become hypocritical and all regimes that are not hypocritical but are just functioning according to the principles that actually make sense from an atheist, biological, rational perspective. So the only group here that you could say you're not operating the way that you say you should would be Christians. Everybody else can actually give I would say a consistent, rational, evidenced support for the atrocities that they commit. So anyway, that was just kind of spin off off of Knives Out 3, which I do recommend, and I really liked it, and it was very moving, and I thought it was well done. I get really tired of directors and artists who make good work, who seem to want they want to have their cake and eat it too, kind of a situation. They want things to be true and not true at the same time. They want to be able to like say, all we can take all the fruit of Christianity without actually having the tree, without actually having Christianity. You've probably heard this a bunch. People can be good without God. I guess it depends on what you mean by that. I hardly think at this point in the United States or really around the whole world at this point that it's basically impossible to escape Christian morality at this point. So it it's kind of silly at this point to say like, oh, you don't need to be a Christian in order to be a morally upright person. It's like, well, what's your standard for what's morally upright? And they start saying, well, like what Father Judd did when he operated like Jesus. You're like, right. If that's your idea of what morality is, like, sure. Um, but again, that partly because of how influential it's been. All right, so it's about 7:30. Thank you, Lisa, for interacting so much on this one because it definitely made it possible for me to answer some stuff and talk. Um, there is a little bit of a lag and a delay. I know that can be difficult. Um, but yeah, I really appreciate you being here and being supportive. Okay, so I'm going to sign out now, and I will talk to you all in a couple of weeks. And do send me your questions if you want. If you come on the live chat, would you please just say hi, write something? Otherwise, I'm just going to talk. I don't really want to do that, but I don't know what else to do. So, um, I can do that though. I can talk. I'm. I can. I should talk. I can talk. All right. Anyway, I'll see you in about a couple of weeks, and send me your questions if you want me to answer them here. And I will talk to you later. Until next time.